morning, everyone, and welcome to an XTIVIA webinar, delivering the information you need for the business future you want. We're sharing our knowledge to help your business thrive in today's new normal. My name is Alex Killian, and I'm the video producer here on XTIVIA's marketing team. And today you'll be hearing from Bill Walter. Bill is the managing director in DHG's government contracting advisory practice and a good friend of the GovCon 365 division. And we're really excited to have him with us this morning. With that, I'll go ahead and pass it over to Bill. Bill, thank you for joining us this morning.
All right, thank you, appreciate it. And today we're going to do a quick run through about a couple of things that have come through with this new normal. And what we're going to be talking about is the Paycheck Protection Program, which was an element of the CARES Act, was passed back in March 27th of this year. And the Paycheck Protection Program is basically a loan program to help stimulate the economy. There were about 5 million of these loans that were provided for small businesses. And the cool feature about them is that they provide for forgiveness if you keep your people employed. And that does generate some kind of special requirements that government contractors, I believe, need to take into consideration. The CARES Act also provided another section called 3610, which was federal contractor authority. And in section 3610, this provides for if a company has a contract with the federal government, the contracting officer may do certain things, may do. We'll talk about that in a little bit. If you have people that can't work from home, they must be on the site, but the site's closed. There's special reimbursement elements that are provided there. And if you look at the two differently, it could have some surprising and unfortunate effects on you as you move forward, but we'll talk about that. We're also going to talk about an overall element of the Payroll Protection Program, Paycheck Protection Program, because it has had over 20 different pieces of guidance that have come out with it since it was first brought in, basically in the first part of April. So lots of guidance, lots of changes, and there have actually been 3 different laws that have come in to impact how the PPP works. We're going to talk about the CARES Act. We're going to talk a little bit more about Section 3610 and the reimbursements that you can get there. And I'm going to give you my opinion at the end of the day as to what I think is going to happen as we move forward. So with that, I got to start off with a disclaimer. I'm an accountant, I'm a CPA, but I do have a legal disclaimer because this stuff is moving so quickly, and there is not a great level of guidance that's available for the government contractor and the PPP. All of the guidance that's available is associated with borrowers and lenders under the Paycheck Protection Program. So at any point in time, a new piece of guidance may come out. There may be a new interpretation. There may be something else. So the stuff that I'm telling you is based on what we know today. And I do stay up to date with this. I'm a part of Dixon Hughes Goodman's task force, the SBA task force, where every morning there's a group of a little more than a dozen of us that get together across industries, across service lines, and we talk about what's happening with our clients, what's happening with industries, what's happening with, very specifically, the Paycheck Protection Program and how that works. So this stuff could change any minute. They may have issued some guidance before I started talking that I haven't had a chance to look at yet. So whatever you do, if you're going to make decisions, make sure that you follow up with to make sure you have the most current guidance. And my contact information is on the first page if you need it. All right, so let's jump in here. And the CARES Act, like I said, was passed on March 27th. The first 2 sections that we talk about, 1102 and 1106. 1102 introduces the Paycheck Protection Program, and it talks about how you can get a certain amount of money in the form of a loan, and that is basically 2.5 times the payroll that you have on a monthly basis from the prior year. So you take 2.5 times your average payroll, and the first pieces of guidance came out. There were a lot of changes in definitions. Is this included in payroll? Is this included in payroll? What are the non-eligible payroll costs? All of those things had to be taken into consideration just to figure out how to get to the amount that you're actually allowed to be able to get loans. Section 1106 is all about forgiveness. So you may get a loan if your payroll is $1 million a month on average, then you would be eligible for $2.5 million of the Paycheck Protection Program loan. And then that $2.5 million you have to spend in a certain way for payroll related costs and very specific other types of costs. And if you do it the right way, Section 1106 says we'll forgive the entire amount, but you have to keep people employed. You can't make significant pay cuts and those types of things. And we'll run over that very briefly. PPP and the Healthcare Enhancement Act passed on April 24th. Basically what that did was that added more money. So the original Paycheck Protection Program was $349 billion of money that was available to companies. And this added another $300 billion with a B dollars to that. Then June 5th, a month later, Congress and the president get together again and they come back and they come up with a PPP Flexibility Act. And this changed some of the terms that were in there, but were very beneficial to the borrowers. And we'll talk about what those details are. And then just a couple of weeks ago, the president signed into law the PPP loan extension, which basically the PPP Flexibility Act ended on June 30th, no more loans, but they still had some money left over. So they said, okay, we'll give borrowers until August to determine or to apply for loans. So you can see we've had 4 different laws that have come in the place of less than 3 months that all impact this very significant amount of money. And it's close to $600 billion that we're talking about here. The guidance that is available today, the PPP guidance is available on the Treasury website, but it's basically issued by the Small Business Administration. The 2 agencies are working hand in hand and delivering and publishing and talking about this. And we hear Secretary Mnuchin talk quite a bit about the PPP program and how people who get these PPP loans, we're going to audit them. We're going to make sure they're doing it properly. But just last week, he was out saying, you know, this is going to be a lot of work. We've got over 6 million loans. I'm sorry, almost 5 million loans. And we got to go through and look at each one of these. Man, we got to find a better way to do this. So maybe for certain loans of a certain value, we'll just grant automatic forgiveness. So we're hearing things, we're seeing things, we're reading things that are changing on this with a tremendous amount. But you notice there's nothing under PPP that's issued by the Department of Defense or by the Office of Management and Budget or by the FAR Council. So PPP is a loan program. So all of a sudden, you know, if you're a government contractor, you're tied into cost. You know that cost is an important issue for you. And we'll talk about what that means here as we move forward. So Section 3610, once again, the Office of Management and Budget issued some guidance saying, hey, contracting officers out there, you've got flexibility in your contracts. And if a contractor can't work because your facility is closed down, we want you to understand you have the flexibility to work with these companies and pay them for their employees, so that once we get to our new normal and we get out of this lockdown situation, we'll be able to put people right back to work. We don't want you to let them go, because if you let them go, we may not be able to get them back to help the government. Okay, so if you move forward. Okay, so the Paycheck Protection Program itself, it was designed for small businesses. And when I put this through QC review, my people who looked at it said, Bill, you have all these asterisks behind each one of these items, but you don't have any footnotes. I said, I know. I'm trying to get the effect here. The forgivable loans are for businesses with less than 500 employees. There's all sorts of caveats on that. If you're a small business, or maybe you're classified as a large business because of a revenue breakthrough, but you only have 250 employees, you could get a PPP loan. What they did with this is forget about all the NAICS codes and all the rest of the stuff. They came in and said, we want to get money in the hands of small businesses, and those are businesses with less than 500 employees. Okay, so there are some caveats. You could have had more than 500 employees. If you haven't applied yet and there's still money left, you've got till the middle of August to be able to apply for a PPP loan. You were able to get 2.5 times the average monthly payroll in 2019, and it was capped at $100,000 per employee. Well, they've had some other caveats that have come out with some of the new guidance where owners of a business, their compensation may be capped at below $100,000. And if you're an S corp, then your payroll may have to include amounts for retirement and health care. So there's a lot of nuances that have come into this as people have asked questions over the months that this has been in place. It allows you to spend money on payroll costs, both payroll, health care, and retirement, and non-payroll costs, rent, utilities, and mortgage interest. And once again, what the asterisk is there because a lot of questions have come out. Well, what's in healthcare? What's included in retirement? What if I prepay this? What if I prepay that? And payroll also has adjustments because it has to be for U.S.-based employees. So if you have foreign-based employees, you can't use PPP money for them. And then, of course, rent, utilities, and mortgage interest. I've had a lot of questions on mortgage interest where people are saying, well, but that's not an allowable cost. Well, it's not allowable cost on government contracting, so you can't include it in your incurred cost submission. But if you use PPP funds to pay mortgage interest, then there should be no impact on your government contracts because of the fact that you didn't include that mortgage interest on any of your cost justified contracts if you have them. You're given 8 weeks. They came out initially with this 8-week window, 8 weeks to spend on payroll and non-payroll costs. As we're going to talk about in a minute, the Flexibility Act moved that out to 24 weeks. But even then, the 8 weeks came out with some clarifications. It's like the law says it starts the date you get the proceeds from the loan. Then the SBA and the Treasury came in and said, well, we're going to have an alternate covered period that make it line up with your payroll periods, because we know if you got this on a Wednesday and your payroll's on a Friday, the numbers might not match up properly. So they put a little bit of flexibility in there to help the borrower. Forgiveness reductions for reduced headcount and pay cuts. So if you cut your employees who made less than $100,000 by more than 25%, if you cut their pay, then the amount of your forgiveness was going to be reduced. If you started out the year with 400 employees and at the end of the period for forgiveness, you're down to 300 employees, there's another adjustment that gets made to the forgiveness. So if you got $2.5 million, even if you spent the money all on payroll and all on these other forgivable costs, you still may not get 100% of that forgiven. The initial $349 billion was lent in 13 days, less than 2 weeks. And a lot of people are complaining about that. I read an op-ed in the Washington Post this weekend, and I'm like, you guys are nuts. The federal government, with all the garbage that they take, they issued, I think it was 1.6 million loans and lent out $349 billion in 13 days. It was a massive effort between the banks, the agencies, the people applying, and no matter what, you're going to have some sour grapes. I think it's pretty amazing that was able to get taken care of that quickly. Since that point in time, the SBA and Treasury have come out and they've issued over 20 final interim rules on what's eligible and how does it get forgiven. So these things are called IFRs, interim final rules, and they're actually on the Treasury website. If you want to find out about them, just Google Department of Treasury PPP. It'll take you right to the site. It'll say guidance for borrowers. You can read them all. I've read them many times. I've got them over here on the floor of my office by number because we had a lot of questions on them. Okay, on to our next slide. We're going to talk about the PPP and the Healthcare Enhancement Act. This one came out very quickly after the original CARES Act. And here, this was actually called Phase 3.5 of the stimulus program. Phase 3.0, CARES Act, was the third major law that came into play. So Phase 3.5 simply added some funding. So it added $321 billion to the $349 billion that was already out there. But it also added some money for other types of loans that are available to small businesses, an economic injury disaster loan, SBA disaster loans. And it also put about $100 billion into public health and trying to find the I have a complete brain loss. The solution for curing people from their COVID-19 when they get it, the vaccination. But the thing I point out to a lot of people about Phase 3.5 is it appropriated $2.1 billion in salaries for the Small Business Administration. The SBA is tasked with making sure that there's no fraud, waste, or abuse in the PPP funding. So the salaries and wages for the SBA, I have a feeling that they're going to be hiring a lot of people, a lot of auditors to come in and look at this after the fact, because Secretary Mnuchin did announce any PPP loan over $2 million will be audited. And this is the money that's going to help pay for those auditors. They're not in place yet. They're not even sure what they're going to be auditing. But the forgiveness, people are starting to submit the forgiveness application. So this stuff is just moving so fast. If we can move to the next slide, we're going to talk about the PPP Flexibility Act. And in this, they changed it to make it easier for the borrowers. So they extended the covered period from 8 weeks to 24 weeks. Most of my government contractor clients, I recommend they take the 24 weeks. As we're going to talk about in a little bit, there may be some credits, there may be some other issues that you're going to have to take into consideration. This did provide safe harbors for loan forgiveness. So it says if you're a small business and because of COVID, your financial book, your financial look has reduced so much that there's no way you're going to be able to hire all the people back, then they're not going to reduce your amount of forgiveness because you can't meet the number of FTEs, the full-time equivalents. If you're unable to rehire employees, they're not going to reduce your full-time equivalent for those individuals. If you try to rehire an employee and they send back a note saying, look, I'm getting this extended unemployment benefit from the state and the feds, so I'm not about to come back to work because I'm better off working from not working from home. If you want to avoid getting an FTE reduction, you're going to have to notify the local state employment commission that you offered Joe Smith the job back and he said no. So a lot of little caveats that get built into this. The original law, Section 1102 and 1106, didn't say anything about a cap on non-payroll expenses. The Secretary of the Treasury brought that in and the SBA, and they felt about 25% would be appropriate. When Congress issued the Flexibility Act, they said, we don't know why you guys came up with that number. That's not what we said, but we think it should be up to 40% of the PPP loan can be spent on the rent, mortgage, interest, and utilities. So another little bit of guidance that comes in is people are already in the 7th and 8th week of their loan process. If you read the law, it says if you don't spend 60% of payroll on payroll, you don't get any forgiveness. There was guidance and a joint statement issued by the SBA and Treasury that said, no. If you spend 58% on payroll and 42% on non-payroll and 58% on payroll, we're still going to make sure that you get some forgiveness, but that 2% differential may be a factor. Okay, so it's not just the rules, the interim final rules you need to read. You also need to read the articles and other guidance that come out on the program. Okay, if we could switch to the next slide. The Payroll Protection Program Flexibility Act also had a couple of other things that it did. One, it says that if you're deferring taxes, in the original PPP, it said that you couldn't do the payroll taxes and get the PPP benefit. They said, hey, we're going to allow you to qualify for some separate elements here. It extended the loan terms, and it said, hey, the original PPP was 2 years, and they felt that would be too much stress on small businesses coming out of this, or for the portion that doesn't get forgiven, and they extended it to 5 years. But it's only 5 years for the loans that are awarded after the PPP Flexibility Act was passed. So you've already got a note in place because your loan was before then. Well, they're going to come in and say, it's 2 years. If you want to go 5 years, you got to request it from your bank because there's already a note in place between you and the bank that says it's 2 years. I've seen several banks that said, we're just going to change everybody, not a problem. I've seen 2 banks that have come in and said, no, we're going to keep it at 2 years. So that's between you and the bank. And if your bank is being stubborn, you may want to reach out to your SBA people and say, hey, what can you do to help us with this bank? It does provide, if the reason that you've lost business is because you've got the social distancing and all these health-related actions, et cetera, this is what is one of the safe harbors that came in. It said, hey, if you can't get to the same operating capacity, but it has to be the social distancing and health-related actions. I have several clients who had a big contract that ended up in January, completed, and they didn't win the recompete, so now they can't meet the January headcount. But it's because they lost the recompete. It's not because of COVID. So for that particular client, I don't believe that the Safe Harbor Act applies. And what I do is I show the client the words, I help them understand it, and they see my perspective, and it's up to them if how they want to read the different certifications that go with it. And it also provides for a 10-month window. So if you apply for forgiveness, you don't have to repay the debt until 10 months after your application, and then you're going to have to start paying principal and interest until it does actually get forgiven. Okay, if we can switch to the next slide. Okay, so that's pretty much it for the PPP. Okay, and I'm going to talk about some of the government contractor issues here towards the end of as we get into this. So let's talk about the 3610 real quick. And what this does is this is all optional at the eyes of the contracting officer. There's no requirement, there's no leverage you have, there's no bat that you can bring in that says, Congress said you have to do this. The law says if there are funds available, the contracting officer can modify a contract to provide for reimbursement of the wages that you had to pay to keep your employees with the paycheck. But it can't exceed an average of 40 hours per week, but it can include sick leave. Okay, so now all of a sudden, if you don't have a PPP, and if you just look at this independently, the contracting officers are encouraged to let me put my people on an administrative standby. They're not going to work. They can't get into the facility because of work site restrictions. And the work site restrictions have to be between January 31st, 2020 and September 30th, 2020. And the government wants to keep you, your employees, and your subcontractors in a ready state. So all of these things come into play. And the law itself, Section 3610, closes off by saying, hey, whatever the maximum reimbursement is for the employees, 40 hours per week at the lowest rate in the contract, the lowest billing rate applicable to them, has to be reduced by the amount of credit the contractor is allowed under the Family First Corona Response Act. And that's basically provided for emergency sick leave and emergency family medical leave. So if you've already requested tax credits because you have people who are on either of those two programs, you can't use those same dollars for Section 3610. Okay? And this is where the term double dipping comes into play. The government doesn't want you to get both the tax credit and the reimbursement. Pick one or the other. And it doesn't specifically say the PPP, but most of the guidance that's coming out from the different agencies identifies if you get loan forgiveness, and then you can't use the same dollars for loan forgiveness that you're using for reimbursement under Section 3610. Okay, we can move on to the next slide. Okay, DoD issued guidance, and what they did was they actually issued a whole new DFARS clause, and the DFARS clause is 231.205-79. So 31 is the cost principles. So this is a DoD cost principle clause that was put into place on April 8th. Okay, and it basically states that the costs that are made allowable by this clause, and this was put in place for Section 3610, have to be reduced by any amount the contractor is eligible to receive under any other federal payment allowance, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So if you get a PPP forgiven, and if you're 100% cost reimbursement, and if you build all of your employees, none of them could work at the facility, none of them could work from home, but you got reimbursed for their 40 hours per week, right? And you got a PPP loan, this clause is saying, can't do that. That's double dipping. You can take one or the So this initial guidance came out. It was in a DFARS class deviation, which basically says the normal rules in the FAR don't apply, and you have to use these when dealing with Section 3610. A lot of attorneys I talk to anticipate that there's going to be a little bit of litigation on this particular matter because, interestingly enough, this cost principle is only going to be applicable to contracts that are awarded after the date of the clause, because there's another clause in the contract that says, hey, your contract is going to be subject to the cost principles in place at the time the contract was awarded. So these are all new clauses. A whole host of stuff is coming into play. The Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment issued another piece of guidance in April. And this one says proper administration and traceability of actions under Section 3610 of the CARES Act is going to require special attention, and the DCAA is being tasked to look at this as well. So if you have an incurred cost submission, I did speak with DCAA last week actually, and I had some other issues that we were trying to go through, but I asked them, I said, what are you guys doing about PPP? What are you guys doing about Section 3610? And they said, well, we're really not sure yet, but we're starting to get requests on 3610. And as far as we're concerned, if somebody doesn't need the PPP to pay for their employees' payroll, then they shouldn't have gotten it in the first place. So all of a sudden, I'm sensing my concerns about PPP and the government contractor are going to be coming to bear. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. So this is the DoD guidance. The class deviation memorandum that came out also identifies the fact that, hey, we've got a whole bunch of different stimulus pieces that are coming out here. We've got sections 1102 and 1106 of the CARES Act. I mean, some small businesses can get relief. And if they do get relief, then they shouldn't be double dipping and get reimbursement from the DoD under the provisions of Section 3610. Well, there's a couple of nuances here. What if you have somebody that makes more than $100,000 a year? Okay, that person is, the PPP only provides some assistance for the compensation that's under $100,000 a year. So if you have a scientist that's been around for a long time making $150,000 a year, that $50,000 is not being used for payroll protection. So lots of really exciting, for me being an accountant, nuances associated with these different rules and how they come into play. Pop me to the next slide, please. Okay. The DoD, Department of Defense, issued a 3610 frequently asked questions. It's on their website. If you Google 3610 DoD guidance, it'll take you right to the DoD acquisition website, and you can read this. But about a month ago, when they issued question 23, somebody said, hey, we have this PPP. Well, if we get a credit, that's really not applicable to government contracts, right? And we think that it's just a loan, and we can use it however we want to. And the Department of Defense came back and said, no, we disagree. Our interpretation is that if you get a PPP loan, initially, they said, if you get a PPP loan, we want to see a reduction in your billings for any PPP loan that you've made. And that raised, that you received. That raised a whole bunch of concern, because why should I have to credit all my PPP loan against this contract? You know, that just doesn't make sense. Well, they did update that on April 24th, and they changed it a little bit to say that are forgiven. So the guidance came in, it made it a little bit clear, because before it simply said, hey, if you obtained a PPP loan, we want to start seeing credits. So this was like one of the first times we really saw the Department of Defense coming in, any government agency, and actually identifying how forgiveness under a PPP may impact government contracts outside of Section 3610. Okay, on to our next slide. Okay. And so I gave you DOD's guidance. All of the super secret squirrel agencies have come out with their own guidance. The Department of Homeland Security has guidance. GSA also issued guidance on Section 3610. And what they came out and said was, we really don't expect to see a lot of Section 3610 requests because of the types of contracts that we're responsible for. There's a website out there with Kroll and Mooring, not that I'm plugging anybody, but if you Google Section 3610 Kroll and Mooring, you'll get a table that they've painstakingly put together for guidance from 6 different agencies. And it talks about how each agency has taken this one paragraph in Section 3610 and expanded it completely differently. A lot of the guidance that is out there is on the contractor certifying that any credits are being considered in these amounts. And if you got a PPP credit, make sure that that's reflected and you're not double dipping in any way. All the guidance that comes out on Section 3610 says if there are credits under the Family First Corona Response Act or under the CARES Act, which includes PPP, but it also includes some tax credits and some other elements, they're saying, hey, no double dipping here. So if you're a government contractor, this is where that double dipping concept, I believe, is going to become pretty challenging. If we can slip to the next slide. Okay. Loan forgiveness. Once you've spent all your PPP money, you can choose to use 8 weeks. You can choose to use 24 weeks. Either way you do it, there's an application form that's available on the SBA website or the Department of Treasury website. And in there, it says that you're going to have to verify the number of full-time equivalents. Did you have a drop? You're going to have to identify if you had salary curtailments, anything like that. All that information is going to go into a series of forms. There's no time specified when you have to apply for forgiveness. However, once you do submit the application, the bank has 60 days to respond to your forgiveness application and tell you yes or no. And the SBA also has a 30 days in there that they can work in, but there's a little caveat that a lot of people aren't looking at. I did look at. It says at the end of this that, hey, no matter what, you have to maintain the data that's associated here for 6 years because that's the statute of limitations. So if you get a PPP loan, you get it forgiven, you give the government all the credits back. 3 years from now, the SBA comes in and audits and says, you know, you guys really did well during that period. You really didn't need that money. We're gonna convert this from forgivable back into a term loan. And it'll be 2 years, 5 years, whatever. So these are some areas that we don't know enough about. There was an article, if you subscribe to the Wall Street Journal, take a look at the weekend edition. There was an article in there about PPP and the government contractor. So it's the type of thing that I'm expecting to see a little bit more feedback on because I don't think government contractors have ever gotten a fair deal in the eyes of the media. And the media has been voracious when it comes to PPPs and the things that are going on. Okay, so next slide. In the area of government contracting, I've had a lot of questions. Can I invoice the government and can I get my loan forgiven? Okay. If you take a look at this, there is really no specific PPP guidance that's issued anywhere other than for Section 3610, which is those requests for reimbursement for people who are on standby because of the facility shutdown. So if you don't have any $3610 and you have a PPP loan, then you get it forgiven. Okay, what can the government do? What are your obligations? Well, the area that I look at is if you have cost reimbursement contracts. Those cost reimbursement contracts are subject to the FAR cost principles, and FAR 31201-5, which is credits, specifically states that if you bill the government for a cost and you get any income rebate allowance or other credit, and I underlined that, that's my highlight there, relating to any allowable cost received or accrued to the contractor, shall be credited to the government either as a cost reduction or as a cash refund. So if you have cost reimbursement contracts or the materials portion of a T&M contract, these cost principles will apply. And any PPP forgiveness, I believe, will come back as a credit. I think it clearly fits the definition. We've got the double dipping language everywhere else that kind of helps to substantiate this. But these are the only contracts that are subject to the cost principles. If you have a fixed price contract or a time and materials contract, the cost principles don't apply. That new DoD cost principle that we talked about a few slides ago doesn't apply. So what can the government do to tell you that you have to give that money back? I'm not sure that there's a contractually spelled out argument that says that that money has to be given back. With that said, most of my clients that I work with, they're like, but I don't want to cause a rub. I don't want to get my name on the front page of the newspaper. What do I do? I've had some other clients who have talked with their contracting officer and they wanted the dollar for dollar reduction on their time and materials contracts. And so right now we're kind of waiting to see what guidance the government is going to issue for government contractors, if any. If they don't issue any guidance, I think that cost reimbursement contracts are going to have to be given credits. But as for time and materials and fixed price contracts, I'm not sure where the government has leverage within the inside the contract document. Okay, move to the next slide. Okay, so now what can we expect? And I've been in this industry for over 35 years. When I started my career as a DCA auditor back in 1983, we did not yet have the federal acquisition regulation in place. It was just being written. It was just coming out. It was a whole new set of regulations. So what types of actions can we expect? I believe that there's a high potential for post-loan scrutiny of borrowers and lenders. We're already seeing it in the media. It's an election year. We hear a lot of things. Drums are rattling. I think it's going to be very important that people who got these PPP loans recognize that. There are 8 express certifications that you have to make under your PPP application. There was a lot of hoopla about this up front because Steak and Shake and Ruth's Chris Steakhouse and the Los Angeles Lakers got PPP loans. And Secretary Mnuchin came out and said, hey, we're going to make sure that you were entitled to this, that you had an economic need for this, yet the loan condition itself, the certification says, current economic uncertainty makes this loan request necessary to support my business. So I've told all my clients, you should have a folder that says economic uncertainty for the PPP, and every article, every stretch out of payments from your customers, every contracting officer that said that I'm not sure how long we're going to be able to sustain this. Keep all that stuff in a file, because if an audit comes in later, and if you're over 2 million, it will come in, they're going to be looking to validate that the economic uncertainty existed. So you want to be able to document that. If you don't, they could come back and say, well, we don't believe that you entered into this loan in good faith, and therefore there may be some other issues. The government did put a couple of safe havens in that said, if you got a PPP loan, and then by, I forget the exact date, if you gave it back to the government by this date, they would take the position that your certification was made in good faith. If you had a loan for under $2 million, then they're going to take the position that your certification was made in good faith. So if you're over $2 million, expect that they're going to take a look at that. And there could be some pressure. There's going to be $2.1 billion of salaries and wages of people coming in to take a look at this. And I don't know the position they're going to take. I will tell you, if they read the interim final rule number 1, it says that the intent of the PPP is to allow borrowers to maximize forgiveness. Okay? It's written right into the rules. But if we take a look at some prior relief programs, there were the TARP funds. And this is where people were using, this is back with the real estate time, where there was additional money that was thrown into the marketplace, and there was some fraud, there was some waste, there was some abuse, and there were some people that got in trouble where they made statements in their application that were not true, and then they were pursued legally. And here's some court cases if you'd like to take them up. And then there are other cases where people were using them for the wrong purposes. The op-ed in the Washington Post this past weekend identified that there was a person that got a PPP loan, and he bought Humbers for himself. He bought one for his wife. He bought one for his brother-in-law because he was such a nice guy. Okay, and that sort of thing is going to escalate, cause a lot of fire to be put on, a lot of light to be put onto this program. So if you are a PPP recipient, make sure you're using it for payroll for at least 60% of the dollars. And if you're using the 40% for rent, mortgage on interest, and utilities, make sure they're documented well. Because there are several examples of people who are using the money inappropriately. Unfortunately, it happens all the time. The government's job is to make sure that they can effectively take a look at that. Okay, let's take a look at the next slide. Okay, and what we find is that on April 10th, there was another piece of guidance that came out from the Office of Management and Budget. This is right under the Executive Office of the President. And it says, hey, this is the stuff we're trying to do. We need to keep the economy alive. We need to put things in there. So we want to achieve your missions. We want to make sure we can get things done quickly. We want to make sure that everything is transparent and contractors, receivers of the money are accountable. Okay? So here they had they said, we're not going to create a new Surgeon General for this, but we're going to get representatives from all 19 of the Surgeon Generals. And we're going to create this new Pandemic Response Accountability Committee, the PRAC. And so this group has already issued its first report. If we can skip to the next slide. And in its first report, I'll get to that in just a second. I forgot I put this one in here. So the other one was M20-21. And it said, hey, let's keep things going. Let's keep things moving forward. And then a couple of days later, they issue the second memorandum. And in here, it reiterated some of the stuff that was in the first slide, but it said we need to support contractor resiliency, allowing them to be flexible. We don't have to be so rigid. But it says carefully consider if reimbursing paid leave to keep the contractor in a ready state is the best interest of the government today and in the future. So they're pushing more guidance. The first piece of guidance said, hey, throw the money out there. We're going to trust the companies to use it wisely. Now it's coming back and saying, hey, make sure it's being used properly, but be mindful of challenges that small businesses face. So it's like audit the daylights out of them, but be not too much. And then it also says exercise good stewardship of the funds that Congress has given you as a contracting officer. Okay, maintain your mission focus. There are restrictions in Section 3610, the credits that have to be considered, the minimum daily amount, no more than 40 hours per week. Those are the types of issues that we have to work with. And then the last item is secure the necessary documentation, support reimbursement to prevent duplication of payment. So guys, this is going to be audited. There are going to be people coming in 1 year, 1 day to 6 years after the fact to look at the documentation. It's just as if it's going to be a DCAA incurred cost audit. So be prepared for that. Okay, now the PRAC report is on our next slide. And in here, this is a very long report. It lists all 37 of the agencies that are involved in the pandemic response. And they basically interviewed the leadership of each one of these 37 agencies and asked them, what are their concerns? So this first report wasn't really an audit report, it was more of a survey. And it's available, it came out last month. And they said there are all sorts of different challenges. A lot of them are tied to the specific agency requirements, but they did identify 4 common concerns. Number 1, financial management of CARES Act and other funds. Okay, managing grants. Grants are free money. I'm giving you this money to give away. So people are concerned about that. In fact, the EIDL, the Economic Injury Disaster Loans, if you applied for one of those, you would get a $10,000 grant. Okay, doesn't have to be repaid. So the government wants to make sure that you don't use that $10,000 to pay for costs that you're also getting reimbursed for. And if you've got the EIDL grant, it's an offset to the forgiveness of the PPP loan. So lots of these things are loosely pulled together in the push to get this out. IT and management is a concern that they had, and protecting health and safety while making sure you can keep your agency running are there. But the top one, financial management of CARES Act and other funds. I keep hearing $2.1 billion in salaries for the SBA, and that's how they're going to demonstrate that they did the right thing with the money. So that could be some fun challenges. Okay, and then if we can go to our last slide, I hope. Okay, what are the types of questions we should be asking? Number 1, hey, isn't the lender a layer of protection? I gave them the form, all the rest of it. Shouldn't they do due diligence? The answer is no. And the rush to get this funding out in 13 days or less. Congress the law, the Department of Treasury said to the bankers, we're not going to hold you accountable for the bad things here. You can rely on the certification of the borrower. What happens if I get approved? I receive the loan proceeds and nothing's forgiven, or it is forgiven, and then later it's determined that I'm ineligible. I would expect that you're going to find that the government's going to say, you need to pay that money back. 2 years, 5 years, hopefully, or you can fight it. And there are a bunch of attorneys that are working very diligently to be there at the ready to help you if you need it. How can PPP forgiveness at one of my subcontractors impact my prime contract? Well, if I have a cost reimbursement prime contract and somebody gets a PPP loan, that I need to make sure that I get that credit because I have to flow those cost principles down to that small business. If a small business gets a PPP loan, they're one of my subcontractors, and they get the credit, and DCAA notices it during their incurred cost audit and says, oh, this was associated with this contract at your company. The government's going to come and take the money out of your pocket and expect you to get it out of the small business's pocket. So understanding this is very important. I'd say probably 60% of my questions that I've gotten from my clients who are small businesses have been associated with this prime sub-role. The question I like, what if my rent payments are to an entity that's under common control? Those costs are going to be limited of reimbursement under your cost reimbursement contracts to the cost of ownership. But if it's a rent lease that was in place before February 20th of 2020, then the rent payment can be used, PPP funds can be used to make the rent payment. So kind of like the interest deduction, there may be something there. And finally, can I use loan proceeds to pay interest on a mortgage if interest is an unallowable cost? Well, the answer is yes, you can. It's spelled out right in the rules and right in the laws. You may have auditors pushing to say, well, no, we want that forgiveness to be used for these other elements. So it will probably be a battle at some point in the future. Okay. So with that, I think I'm ready to take any questions that people have. So I'm going to take a drink of tea here real quick and let me listen.
All right. Thank you so much, Bill. It looks like we have gotten a couple questions in. One of them I can address. Someone's wondering if this deck will be emailed out to attendees. And this entire webinar will be available on demand on our website afterwards. So you'll be able to go back and review. And then another question we got in here. What about DoD T&M contracts where they lump those with cost types?
Well, that's going to be a very interesting piece. On your incurred cost submission, you spell out the cost reimbursement contracts and they can see the dollars associated with each one. So in your incurred cost submission, you're going to have a schedule, I believe, that shows how I took my $2.5 million of PPP that got forgiven, and here's how I allocated and assigned it to my various contracts. I believe if I was a DCA auditor, I would be pretty aggressive at saying, well, that's a credit, you can't double dip, and I would try everything in my power to try to get that money back for the taxpayer. We haven't seen any guidance. DCA has not issued one lick of guidance on the PPP yet, how they're going to look at it when they do the incurred cost submissions. My recommendation, normally when I do an incurred cost submission, I won't put the cost detail associated with the labor on my T&M. I certainly will for my M, the reimbursable portion. But that is going to be an area, I think, where it's going to be indicating that the auditors are going to say, I believe we're entitled to a double dip, but there is no contractual mechanism for them to do it unless you do it voluntarily.
All right, excellent. It looks like that's all the questions we've gotten in this morning. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And thank you, Bill, for all of that valuable information. We really appreciate it.
Okay, well, you guys have a most wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you. You do the same.
Thanks now. Bye, guys.